Here in America, we have a debt problem, and we recently surpassed $1 trillion in credit card debt. With the rising cost of everything from fuel to housing, many people are relying on credit cards to bridge the gap for income coming in versus income going out. Now, if you've watched some of my previous videos, I briefly talked about being in credit card debt in my 20s. And at the time, I thought I had everything under control, but behind the scenes, it was destroying my ability to start building long-term wealth. In today's video, I'm gonna be discussing how I got out of credit card debt. But before doing that, I wanna briefly just talk about how I actually got myself in credit card debt in the first place. So I got my first credit card as a freshman in college. I was a young kid, and as soon as I stepped onto a college campus, there were people there willing to give me a credit card. So to me, it was pretty cool. I didn't have very much money, but I did have a credit card that allowed me to buy a bunch of stuff that I didn't even need, and more importantly, that I couldn't even afford. And not very long after actually getting my first credit card, I quickly maxed it out. And after I actually paid off all of my debt, I did try to think back to when I got that card to try to remember, like, what did I actually spend that money on? And you know what? I was never able to remember actually what I bought, which was actually ridiculous. It was completely ridiculous. I believe that my limit on that card at the time was around $500. And now that I look back on it, being $500 in credit card debt was not really that bad if I would have only stopped at $500. But unfortunately, I didn't. I actually ended up going and getting additional credit cards from everything from Best Buy to credit cards for local mechanic shops that I used to buy tires and to make repairs to a car that I was driving at that time. I mean, I was financing furniture and electronics and car repairs. Things were getting out of control pretty quickly. And by the time I had graduated with my bachelor's degree, I had racked up over $7,000 in credit card debt. And on top of that, I had close to $40,000 in student loan debt that I had racked up getting my bachelor's degree, and $7,000 in credit card debt that carried an APR of up to 27% on some of those cards. I was in trouble, but I just didn't realize it yet. So now that you know how I actually got myself into debt, I wanted to now shift and start to talk about some of the things that I did that allowed me to eventually get myself out of credit card debt. So I can remember, just like yesterday, I was sitting at my dining room table. I had all of my credit card bills sprawled out across the table, and I felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. I had all of this debt that I needed to pay, and on top of that, I actually hadn't even landed my first real job. So I was working at the time, but I wasn't actually making that much money, and I was struggling to make ends meet every single month. So after sitting at the table and looking at all of these bills, the very first thing that I did is I just took a deep breath to relax myself. And I grabbed a paper and pencil, and I started to write down the balance that I had on each of the cards that I had open. I also included the interest rate that was attached to each card, and also the monthly minimum payment that was required to pay every single month on each one of the credit cards that I had. That was right around the time that I put my very first budget into place, and I was determined to reduce my living expenses so much so that I could actually start attacking these credit card bills with a vengeance. I mean, my budget was so slim that I wasn't going out to eat very often, and I just didn't have a lot of money to spend on miscellaneous things. I was taking every dollar that I had and I was putting that towards these credit card bills. So I was really starting to make some progress, and I was really starting to feel pretty good about being able to pay off some of this debt. But one thing that you have to remember is that I was paying an average APR of 27% across a couple of different cards. So a majority of the payments that I was making every single month was actually just going to interest and wasn't paying off the principal. And this cycle went on for about a year. And at the end of that first year, I was only able to pay off roughly $800 towards my principal, while the rest of the money that I paid over the course of that year went to interest. Talk about being frustrated. So after the first year of making payments as much as I could towards my debt, I had to go back to the drawing board. So I was having a conversation with one of my friends at the time. He had mentioned that he had opened up a credit card that allowed him to transfer a balance over at 0% interest. And he said that that helped him pay off some debt. Now at the time, he didn't have as much debt that I did, and he really didn't know how much debt that I had. I really didn't feel comfortable sharing that information. And taking mental notes and just listening to the process that he went through that helped him to pay off some of the debt that he had at that time. So as soon as that conversation ended, I started researching how I could incorporate using other credit card companies to pay off my current high interest credit card debts that I had. About a week after having that conversation about using balance transfers to pay off credit card debt, I got a balance transfer offer in the mail. And I thought, you know what, I'll give this a try and just see if it works. Now, mind you, I had not charged anything additional to my credit cards over that first year of being able to only pay off roughly $800 of my credit card. Again, most of the payments that I made had went to interest, so I was completely frustrated and was willing to pretty much try anything at this point to help me speed up paying off this debt. So I went ahead and took a leap of faith and I applied for the credit card, and I believe that I got about a $2,000 limit once I got the card. So I had the $2,000 limit, so I figured I would transfer over as much as I possibly could onto this card just to see if it would help me speed up my debt pay down process. So taking into account the 4% fee that they charged me at the time to transfer a balance over to that card, I had roughly $1,900 and some change on that new credit card, and I had an introductory rate, 0% interest for 12 months. And this actually ended up becoming a game changer for me because I was able to pay off the entirety of that credit card balance in about 7 or 8 months. So within 7 or 8 months, I was able to pay off roughly $1,700 to $1,800 worth of credit card debt at 0% interest, which allowed me to pay off, I believe it was 2 cards at that time. So what I started doing is once I paid off a card, I just cut them up and threw them away in the trash. And I just remember cutting up those first 2 cards, throw them in the trash, they were paid off, and then to this day, have never used them again. I actually don't even know if those accounts are still open. I would imagine they've been closed since I haven't used them. But I had figured out a way that would allow me to attack my credit card debt simply by using other credit card companies to help me do that. So after paying off roughly $1,800 of the money that I transferred from my high interest credit card to my 0% balance transfer card, I realized this was potentially a game changer for me. I had paid off enough debt to where my total credit card debt was around $4,500 in about a year and a half. So after about 18 months, I was able to pay off almost half of the credit card debt that I had that was weighing me down like an anchor. But I was more determined than ever to make sure that I can keep this process going. So what I essentially did after paying off that first card, I actually opened up a new account, and this time I was able to get 0% introductory rate for 18 months. And I was actually able to secure a larger credit line this time around. I believe the new card gave me roughly a $3,000 line of credit on the credit card. And I remember being able to transfer roughly about $2,500 worth of high interest debt over to that card. And that took me about 9 to 10 months to actually pay off that debt. Now, after the third year, I was able to pay my credit card debt down to roughly about $1,500. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out that happened in year 3 is, number one, I was still not charging any new charges to any of the credit cards that I had. I was actually cutting them up and throwing them in the trash as I was paying them off. Secondly, I had secured my first real job after getting out of college about 2 years after graduating from college, which allowed me to pay much more towards my debts every single month. So after that third year, I had roughly $1,500 worth of debt remaining. And at this time, I decided, you know what? I had already opened up 3 or 4 cards over the last 2-year period. Well, I was able to transfer money that I was paying at a much higher interest over to a new card that allowed me to pay 0%. And at this point, I wasn't interested in opening any additional credit cards. So what I did is I took out a personal loan that allowed me to pay off the remaining balance. And I made a promise to myself that I was going to be able to pay off that $1,800 in 6 months or less. And I was actually able to pay it off in 5. So the entire process, starting out with me sitting at my dining room table with all of my credit card bills sprawled out on the table, to actually paying my last payment, took roughly about 3.5 years. Now I know for some people, this is an extremely long time to actually pay off a credit card debt. But one thing to keep in mind is that during my first year, I really didn't understand the different tools and avenues that were available to me that would have allowed me to tackle that debt that much faster. I also didn't have a real job after college until about 1.5 to 2 years after graduating. So that slowed down my process some as well. But if I ever had to go through this process ever again, I would absolutely use the balance transfer method to help me get some of these debts paid off much faster. And after sending in the last payment to pay off that personal loan, which helped me to pay off all of my credit card debt, I made a promise to myself that I would never let myself get into the type of debt that would require me to actually put a plan in place to get it paid off, because that was a process that I would never want to go through again. And I could tell you 15 years later, I have never put myself in that situation ever again. So if you decide to employ some of the strategies that I use to pay off some debt, just make sure when you're goal setting at the very beginning that you make a promise to yourself to never allow yourself to go into debt again. Now, I did use extreme measures to make sure that I can get myself out of debt. Again, I wasn't making much money at the very beginning, and I was trying to get those debts paid off by any means necessary. So if you're looking to pay off debt and you have a pretty decent paying job, you may not need to go down the same path that I did. But I think the main takeaway is that you put a plan in place that is very aggressive, that will allow you to pay off any debts that you have and stick to the plan regardless of what you have going on. You might have to tweak your lifestyle, but at the end of the day, you're going to be happy once you pay that last bill. So if you're interested in taking a look at how I went through that balance transfer process to pay off some of that high interest debt, make sure you check out the next video.